He was once the wild card of rock and roll, the man who could take an unknown girl and turn her into a symbol of rebellion. But when Kim Fowley died, there was no grand tribute, only the cold sheets of a hospital bed and abuse allegations that refused to fade, cutting through the music world like blades long after he was gone. Old friends wept for him, while others who had once shared the stage called him a predator disguised as a producer. Between the farewells and the condemnations, strange details linger without explanation. A will altered at the last minute, several notebooks gone missing from his room, and an unsigned letter sent to a former member of a girl group he once managed. Was Kim Fowley the victim of revenge? A guilty man who escaped justice? Or somehow both? What truly happened in the final days of his life? Let's take a closer look. Chapter 1. The boy who survived polio twice and the days he disappeared. Hollywood, in the late 1940s. Inside an old movie theater, a young boy sat quietly in the middle row. Light from the silver screen swept across his thin face, but his eyes weren't on the film. Instead, he watched the shadow of his father cast against the side wall, a shadow that trembled and flickered with each frame. His father was a bit part actor, appearing briefly in a single short scene. His mother, a model whose photos occasionally appeared in magazines, was rarely home. The family lived in a damp, rented apartment where cigarette smoke clung to the curtains. Dinner was often nothing more than a hastily bought box of cold cuts from the corner store. Then tragedy struck. Kim contracted polio, not once, but twice, before the age of 10. No one in the neighborhood knew how he'd caught it. His parents called it just bad luck. But one neighbor claimed they'd seen him vanish from home for several days before falling ill, only to return exhausted and pale. Months confined to bed cut Kim off from the world. He smiled rarely, but his eyes always seemed to be measuring, recording. When his health returned, he didn't fall back into the rhythm of childhood. While other kids chased each other in the yard, Kim sat on the steps, turning a broken pocket watch in his hand, listening to the faint jump of its hands. One night, at the age of 12, Kim slipped out of the house and found his way backstage at a concert. He didn't just watch the stage. His eyes scanned every face, the lighting tech wiping sweat with his sleeve, the manager leaning in to whisper to the singer, the musician quietly changing a guitar string. He took it all in, as if filing each detail into a locked box in his mind. Years later, he would say, "The real power doesn't belong to the one singing. It belongs to the one who decides when the song begins and ends." On certain late nights, people saw Kim standing alone under a streetlight, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on something unseen. No one knew what he was thinking, or who he might be remembering. Were those years of illness, abandonment, and silence what shaped Kim Fowley into the sharp, uncompromising figure he became? Or were they simply the armor of a boy still searching for his place in the world? Chapter 2. The day Kim stepped backstage and never returned. In the summer of 1959, Kim Fowley was just 16 years old, but he already knew how to walk into places where he hadn't been invited. Not by forcing his way in, but with a presence that made people hesitate and then step aside. One evening, at a small recording studio in Los Angeles, he arrived with a group of older friends. No one quite remembers who brought him in. Kim didn't sit quietly in a corner. He moved around the room, pausing by the mixing console, leaning over to ask a musician about his guitar. It wasn't the idle curiosity of a teenager. It was the look of someone measuring himself against a much larger picture. Nights like that became routine. Sometimes he would stand silently in the shadows, watching how a sound engineer pressed each button, or quietly listening to whispered conversations about contracts and which artist had just been dropped from a label. People began to notice. This young man wasn't nearly as interested in the sound as he was in the power behind it. Before long, Kim became the go-between for high school bands and industry insiders. He couldn't sing well or play an instrument with any skill, but he had a knack for making people believe they needed him. A former member of the Hollywood Argyles recalled, He wasn't a musician, but somehow he pulled us together and got us a hit record. By the early 60s, Kim was working behind several successful tracks, though his name was rarely mentioned on the radio. He chose a place in the shadows, directing from a distance. Some said he liked it that way. Others claimed it was his way of staying unbound, always ready to walk away if things turned sour. Around this time, a curious detail emerged. A small, brown leather notebook he carried everywhere. People saw him writing in it after recording sessions, not just notes about the music, but sharp, unsentimental observations about everyone he met. When asked, Kim would only smile and say, "It's so I remember who's a friend and who isn't." One old friend claimed that late one night, they caught Kim reading through the notebook under a warm yellow lamp, tearing out a page and slipping it into his pocket. The next morning, that friend was gone from the music project Kim had been managing, without a word of explanation. He began to attract misfits, those who felt shut out of the mainstream. To them, Kim was a doorway, one that could lead to the spotlight, but also to a realm no one else controlled. To others, he was a manipulator, always calculating his next move. A young singer who worked with him later said, "He made me believe I was going to be famous, and I was, but not in the way I'd hoped." From the wings, Kim was building a network of outsiders, turning it into his own launching pad. But what was his true aim? An underground empire, or just a game with no finish line? Chapter 3. The Hitmaker and the Backstage Manipulator. By the mid-70s, Los Angeles was alive with the roar of guitars and pounding drums from garage bands sprouting on every block. Kim Fowley wasn't just watching the wave, he was steering it. One afternoon in 1975, in a cramped Hollywood rental, Kim gathered a group of teenage girls. Tousled hair, ripped jeans, heavy eyeliner. They didn't look like young singers, groomed in polished studios. They looked like they'd just stepped out of a graffiti mural. Kim called them the Runaways. The story of how he gave birth to the band has become rock folklore, and the spark for decades of controversy. Some say he cast them like actors for a rebellious film, knowing instantly who fit the role. Others claim he found them at parties clouded with drugs, where everything was hazy and rules dissolved. From the start, Kim worked differently. He didn't just focus on the music. He shaped their look, their stage presence, even their answers in interviews. Joan Jett later recalled, "He wanted us to be both dangerous and seductive, like the world couldn't decide whether to fear us or fall in love." Success came fast. Shows sold out. The press dubbed the Runaways the teenage punk rock bomb. But behind the stage lights, whispers began to spread. Some band members and those close to them spoke of relentless pressure, rehearsals stretching until dawn, and situations they wouldn't detail in print. One unsettling incident stuck with them. On a tour in Japan, a member discovered a small tape recorder hidden under her hotel pillow. When confronted, Kim shrugged, just to capture song ideas. No one pressed the matter, but from that moment, the distance between him and the girls began to grow. Melody Maker once described Kim as a manager who was both protector and threat. The phrase stirred debate. Was he shielding them from a brutal industry or controlling them for his own ends? A former member remembered walking into a dark studio one night to find Kim alone, listening over and over to an old tape, his gaze far away. When asked, he replied, "That's when they were the truest, before everything changed." What he meant by changed, no one could say. The Runaways kept rising, but the innocence of the early days was fading. And for Kim, fame was no longer just glory. It was a spotlight reaching into the shadows he had long kept hidden. Was it this very success that flung open the door to the accusations that would follow? Or had the seeds of tragedy been planted much earlier, waiting only for the right moment to erupt? Chapter 4. The Runaways. Launching pad or minefield? As the Runaways began to fracture, Kim Fowley found himself caught in a swirl of stories he could no longer control. Former members left the band, some spoke out, others stayed silent, but all seemed to carry away something left unsaid. Over the years, whispers hardened into sharper accounts. In one Los Angeles radio interview, a former member stated plainly, he wasn't just a manager, he crossed the line. The words hung in the air, unexplained, but enough to make listeners pause. Allegations of abuse began to surface, not only from the Runaways era, but stretching years beyond it. Strikingly, some of these stories only emerged after Kim's death, as if people had been waiting for a moment they considered safe to speak. At a rock music panel in New York in 2015, a journalist produced an old letter, said to have been written by a former recording studio employee who had worked with Kim. In it, the writer described seeing him at a backstage party, pulling a cassette tape from his jacket pocket and saying, "I've got this to keep them in line." Who they were was never clarified. No one could confirm whether that tape still existed. A longtime friend of Kim told a different story, gentler, yet just as puzzling. In his later years, Kim often mentioned a locked room somewhere in Hollywood, where he claimed to have stored hundreds of tapes and journals. "One day, people will understand," he'd say. But that room was never found. Meanwhile, social media lit up with debate. On a music forum, one user claimed to have heard a private recording that should never be released, suggesting it was the reason some in the industry stayed quiet about Kim. But there was no proof, only an anonymous username and a few vague descriptions. The irony was that, even as the accusations mounted, Kim continued to appear in public, recounting his past as if it were all part of a long-running joke. "They call me the devil of rock and roll," he once told an audience from the stage. "I take that as a compliment." The crowd laughed, but in the dim light, some remained silent. Did Kim see every accusation as another brick in the legend of Kim Fowley? Or was he deliberately blurring the lines, keeping the truth in the shadows where no one could reach it? Chapter 5: Illness, Accusations, and the Missing Box. In his final years, Kim Fowley battled bladder cancer. He moved in and out of Los Angeles hospitals like a man crossing between two worlds, one lit by cold fluorescent lights, the other steeped in the smoky, whiskey-soaked memories of the 70s. But for Kim, illness was not just a matter of the body. Friends said he changed. Gone were the long strides and booming voice. He began to speak in whispers, even when the room held only two people. "Walls have ears," he once murmured, then smiled faintly. A night nurse at St. John's Hospital remembered one strange habit. Kim often made phone calls at 3 in the morning, though no one ever called him back. His voice was low, sometimes curt, as if issuing orders or negotiating with someone on the other end. "That room, don't let anyone in," she overheard him say once. During his treatment, Kim requested to spend his final days in the home of former Runaways member Jackie Fuchs. The idea stirred fierce debate. Some saw it as a gesture, seeking rest among those who had once been close. Others whispered about hidden motives. In the end, it never happened. What made things even more puzzling were his sudden trips. Just weeks before his health sharply declined, Kim asked a friend to drive him to an address in the Hollywood Hills. He went into an old house for nearly an hour and came out carrying a small wooden box. No one knew what was inside. When asked, he only said, "This has to go with me to the end." After his death, the box was nowhere to be found. Kim's final interviews also took on an unusual tone. Instead of talking about music, he often mentioned unfinished things, people I haven't seen again, and a story no one is willing to believe. His voice was no longer joking. It sounded as if he were sending a message to someone specific, though listeners had no idea who that might be. On January 15, 2015, Kim Fowley died at the age of 75. The hospital listed the cause as complications from cancer, but not everyone believed it was that simple. Some claimed that just days before his death he had been lucid, talking, even planning a new recording session. The wooden box was never found. The late-night calls were never traced, and one question still hangs in the air. Were Kim's final days simply the sad ending of a controversial artist, or the closing chapter of another story that was never told? Chapter 6: The Funeral, The Strange Eyes, and a Legacy That Will Not Fade. Kim Fowley's funeral was not loud. It wasn't the roaring rock and roll spectacle many might have imagined. It was a small gathering, a few familiar faces, a handful of former collaborators, and some people who seemed to be there simply to watch. A longtime friend later said, "There were strange eyes in that funeral, not eyes of grief, but as if they were there to verify something." As the casket was lowered, social media erupted. Posts, recollections, and accusations about Kim began to flood in. One came from Jackie Fuchs, who had once played in the Runaways, recounting a night in the late 70s when, she said, Kim had taken advantage of her before she was of legal age. The story was explosive, not only for its content, but because it came after Kim was already gone. A journalist observed, "If he were alive, this would have been the trial of his life." But Kim was no longer here to answer, and everything slipped into that gray space between memory and truth. Some former colleagues defended him, calling the accounts distorted versions of the past. Others insisted he was a manipulator in music and in life. What kept the story from fading were the odd fragments that surfaced afterward. A former studio technician claimed that years earlier, Kim had asked him to safeguard a box of sensitive tapes and never to open it. After Kim's death, the technician went to return it, only to find the box missing from storage. There was no paperwork, and no one knew what it had contained. Some loyal fans still remember Kim as a kind of musical sorcerer, a man willing to take risks and break every rule. He's part of rock history, they say. For better or worse, he left his mark. But even they cannot deny that the image of Kim Fowley is no longer intact. Perhaps that contradiction is his truest legacy. A man both celebrated and condemned. Someone who could create a legendary band, and also perhaps destroy the youth of those within it. The final question, perhaps, isn't whether he was guilty or innocent. It's why, even after being laid to rest, Kim Fowley continues to ignite debate, leaving behind gaps no one can seem to fill. And whether one day, the secrets he carried to the grave will be revealed or remain buried with him forever. Epilogue: the man who took his secrets to the grave. Kim Fowley's life was like a film without a script. No gentle opening, no tidy ending. Just broken scenes, filled with shadows no one has ever managed to illuminate. From the boy who suffered polio twice for reasons no one could explain, to the young man standing alone under a streetlight, eyes fixed on something invisible. Even when he slipped backstage, it wasn't mere curiosity. He was watching, memorizing, collecting, almost as if he knew that one day he would need it all. And he did. He turned chaos into music. He created the Runaways. He left his imprint on countless songs, existing somewhere on the thin line between genius and troublemaker. But alongside the acclaim came fractures, relationships that broke apart, stories of manipulation, and people who remained forever silent. When illness closed in, Kim crafted his own final image, a room filled with photographs, tapes, papers, and a few things no one could identify. He once said, "When I die, people won't be able to stop talking about me." And he was right. On the day he passed, the conversation wasn't just about music. People spoke of Jackie Fuchs' allegations, of whispered stories from the wings, and of the details no one could explain, the missing box of tapes, the unexplained disappearances before he fell ill, and the strange eyes at his funeral. You could believe he was a misunderstood genius, or a manipulator shielded by the industry. The truth is, no one can ask him anymore. And perhaps that's exactly how he wanted it. Where does Kim's legacy truly lie? In the music? In the uncomfortable truths about power and exploitation in entertainment? Or only in the private memories of those who once knew him? The story closes, but sometimes what is buried with the coffin still lingers, waiting for the right moment to return. If that box of tapes were to resurface, would it give us answers? Or would it simply add one more secret to a life that will never be fully explained?